Welcome to another video. And today we're going to talk about something that's been a feeling that I've had about the internet for the longest time, but I haven't found the right words to talk about it because why do we have language to try to talk about a thing that we can't really describe just yet until we invent the language to talk about it? Essentially today, I've noticed a really interesting trend or a style of video recently that's been popping up all over the place, at least in the last 5 to 10 years, which is a genre called the video essay. And a lot of these video essays seem to revolve around the topic of critique. They're either picking apart a social trend that they've spotted on TikTok, or they're analyzing a tweet somewhere. If they're even called tweets anymore. Generally speaking, these are very smart people offering really educated opinions on certain topics and certain cultural phenomena. And during my off hours, when I'm not editing a YouTube video or making a YouTube video, or when I'm not replying to emails and doing business stuff behind the scene, I really enjoy these YouTube videos. They hit the right balance between intellectual stimulation and entertainment, especially if you start bleeding into the Curtis Connor and Drew Gooden territory. That's just some really good social critique under the guise of comedy, which I really do enjoy. But lately I've been having this epiphany or feeling, should I say, that actually makes me quite uneasy, which is that after a while of consuming this type of content, of this critique-based content, when people are always poking holes in a social trend, when people are taking an aesthetic while picking it apart, it made me realize that the internet's tone started to shift a little bit in the last 5 to 10 years. Because like it or not, what you consume starts to become a part of your operating system, so to speak. So after watching a lot of these criticism videos, I started to view films as objects of critique. I can't see a film without bringing in a kind of critic's lens. Now I can't read a book without questioning the book's integrity, without interrogating the surrounding discourse of the book. And sometimes I struggle to take things at face value when I see someone talking about something on the internet or just in my immediate friend circles. It's almost like everything's worthy of interrogation. Even the most innocent things that you see on the internet, there's a stitch about that thing that appear to be innocent. And if you scroll through some of the comment sections, I don't spend much time on TikTok, unfortunately or fortunately, but I do spend a lot of time on Instagram Reels, and the comments sometimes make me wonder, are we okay as the internet? So in this video, we're going to put a name to this phenomenon of critique, and we're going to explain why critique, even though it's good to be critical about the information that you're consuming, about some of the cultural trends that are happening around us, even though it's good to be critical, but critique in itself as a practice is a double-edged sword, and it could simply lead to unintended consequences. So let's get into it. Let's start with an attempt to define what a critic is. There's this TV show that I really don't remember watching. I think I was quite sick at the time. I caught a horrible cold last winter, and I started watching this show about this bunch of recovering alcoholics named Loudermilk. You've probably seen clips of this TV show on YouTube. It's basically about this really miserable looking guy called Sam Loudermilk as he terrorizes everyone with his critical opinions of the world. So in one of the episodes, this little girl asked Loudermilk, what's the function of a critic? Why do we need critics in our world? And Sam responded with, in the pure diarrhea that is pop culture, you need somebody who's going to be able to find and curate the hidden gems. That's my job. I got to figure out and understand what that artist is trying to do and then inform others. And that's a rather valid definition of a critic, right? So in this culture that is filled with misinformation, with erroneous opinions, there's got to be someone in there who's able to filter through all the crap and to give us their take on a situation, i.e., this is the reason why I am so into video essays, because they give me a sense of security in this whole world of messy opinions. And this is the same reason why some people are drawn to academic research. Like myself previously, before I got rejected for my PhD program, there was a sense of security in grounding my research in expert opinions, as I'm gonna do in this video. There's a sense of solidity in swimming through peer-reviewed articles, and there's a sense of safety. I'm just going to say it's a sense of safety that we crave in this pure diarrhea that is popular culture. But at the same time, I don't think it's fair for us to conflate being critical with being negative, because sometimes it's really easy to cross over into the other territory and to assume that if you're a negative person, somehow you're more elevated and critical than the other people. And in fact, in a New Yorker piece by Merv Ermery, the image of a critic is that of a contemptible creature, a tyrant, a pedant, a crackpot, and above all, a very ungentle reader. And that is a perfect example of when critique bleeds and blends with negativity. And it basically gives this impression of like the critic has to be somehow withdrawn from the world, somehow difficult to talk to, somehow a very irritable person who always assumes that they're standing outside of life. In The Limits of Critique by the literary scholar Rita Felsky, who we've mentioned regarding attunement in the last video, she described this attitude of being somehow estranged from the world, a kind of Archimedean standpoint outside of life. So the stereotypical image of the critic is someone who stands outside of life and who is able to enlighten the unconscious masses of something that they don't have access to. But if you really think about it, if you watch a dozen YouTube videos or a dozen YouTube video essays, what are these critics really saying? If we're really self-honest, they're essentially just offering opinions while assuming the stance of being outside of this opinion. Like I said in the last video, every critic aspires to be an arbiter of taste. They want to set standards and hierarchies for how to interpret a certain thing, but at the end of the day, we still can't deny that criticism belongs in the category of opinion. It might be a very informed opinion. It might be an opinion that's backed up by a lot of research. It might be an argument that's worthy of consideration. But to conflict that with an Archimedean point of being the objective opinion on a situation, that's just simply abusing critique for what it's not supposed to be. In a sense, there are three ingredients to critique. Number one, critique is secondary. It has to have something to piggyback off of, otherwise it's not called a critique. And number two, critique is negative. And when we say negative, it's not just the fact that the person's negative or no, he's having a bad day, he's being quite negative, but it's simply the case that it negates everything it sees, right? The critic is afraid to make any affirmative or positive statements. And number three, critique is almost always backed up by an intellectual aspect. There's research to back it up. There's rigorous argument to back up what I'm saying, and they're prone to citing a bunch of academic articles, which I'm going to do in this video. Then again, this video in itself is a critique of critique, if you can't tell already. Essentially, it's saying that everyday interactions are simply too normal and too obvious, but there has to be a more learned perspective upon this whole thing as to distinguish the critic from the everyday folk. And now here's a really interesting thing. When these three aspects work in tandem, number one, secondary, number two, it's negative, and number three, it carries a kind of intellectual spin to it. If you combine all of these things together, it's almost like you can substitute any opinion that you have into this formula and spin something out as a valid and objective piece of criticism. This mode of engaging with anything, a piece of film, a cultural phenomenon, a TikTok, it's almost like, the stitch function on TikTok. The minute you stitch a response video together with the first video, it's almost like the first video is viewed in a really stupid light, and the second video is almost always considered as a more objective one, and it has the final word on the situation. And all three traits create the illusion that critique or the critic is above common opinions. This is what I would define as a kind of negative sophistry, and this is what happens when we get too deeply into critique. And what started off as a kind of pleasure of pointing out certain anomalies in our culture, of critiquing certain things that we don't really like to see, it could simply turn into an operating system in itself where you can't help but to critique everything you see. And at certain points, we're almost afraid to admit that we like certain things. And what's easier is to assume this aloof and austere attitude of like, I don't really like this thing that much. I don't really love that thing. But that gives me the free rein to criticize people who really do. So in a sense, we have replaced sincerity with a kind of austere attitude towards everything that we see. We're always on guard and suspicious, and for lack of a better word, a little bit paranoid about everything that we're seeing. And, we can't blame anyone for this kind of paranoid attitude because there's just so much misinformation out there. I'm going to have another video coming up about this idea of paranoid reading, which I think explains a lot of the stuff that's going on in our media and in our political discourse. So stay tuned for that one. But for now, let's move on with this topic of critique. So coming back to the thing that we're sacrificing by being too austere and too aloof and too afraid to enjoy anything because, well, you can simply be pegged as a target for critics to criticize you. I do think there's a middle ground between being completely naive and stupid so that you believe anything you see on the internet, and being too critical to the point that you can't enjoy anything in life. We have to somehow still retain the ability to practice critical thinking without letting it turn into a complete negativity about everything that we see. And for that, allow me to quote some passages from this completely brilliant paper that I discovered as a part of my research for my honors thesis. It's called Hope for Critique by Christopher Castiglia. And in this article, Castiglia basically articulates articulated an alternative form of critique based on idealism and hope. Because essentially, critique on some level is a form of gotcha. And as Castiglia has it, it speaks with self-satisfaction about an agency locatable in the text's depth that is actually a phantasmatic location of the critic's own beliefs. Unquote. The problem with excessive criticism is that it could simply turn into confirmation bias. Sometimes you might have an opinion about something, and then by branding your opinion of that thing as critique, you're claiming that, this is what the text is actually claiming to say. This is the depth, the hidden depth that I have access to, but you don't. But in certain cases, if we're not very honest with ourselves, we can brand any opinion as critique and basically claim that this text's hidden depth is speaking the truth while claiming your own opinion as truth. And I think self-satisfaction is the kind of attitude to describe this kind of thing, because a lot of the times, if there's someone who's too sincere about a certain thing, if they really do believe in a certain thing wholeheartedly, they risk seeming naive, risibly optimistic, or insufficiently rigorous, willfully blind to the conditions that make a socially engaged criticism necessary. So in a sense, there he goes again, dreaming about utopia again. There she is again, coming up with the best scenario where everyone is happy. In other words, there's a sneaky mechanism that somehow makes us believe that the more negative a thing is, the more accurate or more close to reality it is. It somehow sketches out this really screwed up idea of like, if you're not negative all the time, then you're simply not close enough to reality, to the point where even the proposal of a better tomorrow starts to seem overly idealistic and stupid and unrigorous. But as Christopher Castiglia argued in this paper, many of the advances in our political history did not come from snarky takedowns or pundits running amok. It came from a few individuals who were so crazy to dream of a better future while risking naivete in a moment. Here's a brilliant excerpt that perfectly explains this, the power of idealism and hope. Quote, from Martin Luther King Jr.'s evocation of his dream to the psychedelic visions of the 1960s hippie culture, one of the critical aspects of activism was its denial of imperative versions of reality in favor of more inventive and experientially diverse versions of the possible, unquote. So maybe in a certain sense, by being courageous enough to sketch out a possible better future, we are already engaging in critique. Maybe the endless circle of poking holes in what's wrong with today is actually distracting us from sketching out a better plan for a better tomorrow. And also, just based on my personal experience, it's really hard to get motivated if we're always looking in the direction of the things that are wrong. And it's always easier to be motivated when you are invested in a better future. While I'm not saying all forms of critique are invalid, but if we push critique too far into the negative end, we could simply lose sight of the purpose, which is to create positive changes, which is to make the world a better place. So in a sense, if you really want to be a good critic, you also need to allocate some time and energy into sketching out and into articulating a better future. In other words, to conclude this viewpoint from Castiglia, hopefulness is not the opposite of critique, but its lifeblood. Unquote. And that is all I want to say on this topic of critique. And I'm so aware that my camera is about to run out of battery because I don't want to risk another faulty take. So I'm going to end this right here. Leave me your thoughts down below in the comment section down below. Do you also feel that the internet is turning us into critics? And do you also feel this kind of negativity creeping upon you when you watch too many video essays? Anyway, Robin Walden here. I'm going to be signing off. Hope you're having a great day. Take care, and I'll see you in the next one.